A proposed highway from Nogales to Wickenburg.
We look to avoid impacts first off, then we look to minimize the impacts, then we look to mitigate the impacts.
Our neighborhood would be heavily impacted by the increased air, light, and noise pollution.
Analyzing the future of the Regional Transportation Authority.
Asking for new money is not easy.
And do you want to use your cell phone while driving? There are rules about that. This is Metro Week. Hi, I'm Andrea Kelly. Thanks for joining us. Today we'll talk transportation, from highways to those who drive on them. That's all coming up after a look at the week's top stories from the Arizona Public Media Newsroom.
The Arizona legislature approved a nearly $10 billion state budget this week. The deal negotiated between lawmakers and the governor was passed on a party line vote, with Republicans supporting the spending plan. It calls for a 2% raise for teachers in the next 2 years and will allow the state universities to borrow money needed for building repairs. Democrats wanted larger teacher raises and restoration of welfare cuts made 2 years ago. The budget will go into effect July 1st. Tucson Unified School District is testing the waters to see whether voters are inclined to support a budget increase at the expense of higher taxes. The district did a survey of voters to find out if they would support borrowing $180 million to $300 million for building repairs and maintenance. Tucson Unified did a similar survey last year, but did not take the question to voters. Funding from the state for school district building maintenance has been cut since 2008, and the district says there's a backlog of needed work. People who have health insurance from United Healthcare no longer have coverage at Northwest Healthcare, which runs Northwest Hospital, Oro Valley Hospital, and a network of doctors. United and Northwest negotiated for several months before they decided they could not come to an agreement about how much the insurance company would reimburse the healthcare providers for services. Patients who have United Healthcare will have to pay out of pocket if they wish to continue to get care from the Northwest Network or find a new provider who accepts United insurance. For more on the week's top stories, visit our website at news.azpm.org.
The Arizona Department of Transportation is studying ways to add a new interstate highway that would eventually connect Nogales to Canada. For now, it's looking at options from Nogales to Wickenburg. I asked Arizona's Interstate 11 study manager, Jay Van Echo, for an update on the planning process.
I-11 is in a Tier 1 environmental impact statement. So what we are doing now is looking at defining a reasonable range of alternatives for I-11 here in the next year. Then we'll come back out and talk to the public about those range of alternatives and see if we did our job correctly and we identified where the alternatives can end up in southern Arizona and throughout the state.
We have a map. ADOT has some complicated maps. We've sort of simplified one down, but we are showing alternate or options A and B, which look like they track pretty much on I-19 and I-10. Maybe that includes widening those streets. Can you explain those two options?
Yes, there's always an option of improving existing roadways. So the alternatives, as you pointed out, A and B, we'll look at I-19 and I-10 through Santa Cruz and Pima County and look at seeing if we can improve those roadways to add the traffic capacity to incorporate an Interstate 11. It's always an option to widen a roadway and see if it can incorporate that traffic.
And then options C and D track west of I-10. They go through the Avra Valley area. Explain those two choices.
Yeah, so the National Environmental Policy Act, of which we're following at Arizona Department of Transportation and Federal Highways Administration, it requires that we have alternatives. You have to have alternatives to compare and contrast. So alternatives C and D are located west of the Tucson Mountains in Avra Valley, as you pointed out, and we will analyze those and compare and contrast those with the A and B that we previously talked about on I-19 and I-10.
So you're looking at environmental impact, costs. What else are you analyzing with all of those options?
Environmental, social, economic, the cost of the economics of building it. Environment is very critical. We also look at technical, traffic, reducing congestion, mobility, safety. Safety is a big concern with us at Arizona Department of Transportation. If you've traveled I-10 between Tucson and Phoenix in the dust storms, or if there's a fatality, that facility gets shut down. And it's really hard to travel around the state because there's just not another high capacity, high priority roadway. So as our population and employment grows, we're looking to have another alternative to move our traffic through the state, especially in southern Arizona.
And especially the traffic that doesn't need to stop necessarily in Phoenix or Tucson, that can keep going through.
A very good question, thank you. Yeah, this is an interstate route. We are obviously very concerned with what happens locally, what happens regionally, but this is a corridor that the United States Department of Transportation codified as an interstate in 2015 to go from Mexico all the way to Canada. So while we are very much interested in local communities and how we impact it, the purpose and need for this facility is as an interstate, and we are looking from the Mexican border to the Nevada border in the Hoover Dam area.
You're holding public meetings this week throughout the state, and I know that the meeting last night in Tucson, there was opposition from people who live in the Avra Valley area. Tell me how you respond to that, or what you take into consideration when you hear that.
We are very interested in opposition. We're very interested in hearing what the public has to say about this roadway. I've talked to many people in Avra Valley, and there are concerns about the environment, concerns about where the roadway would be located. I take that very personally. I've been doing this, environmental science and transportation planning, for about 40 years in southern Arizona. I get some of the best information I can for planning these new roadways from the people who actually live there and have to live with it. That being said, opposition is just part of the issue. We have people who are proponents of it also, and those comments we also take into consideration, and we look at that, we categorize it, we put that in our report, and we try to address every comment that comes to us in the public meetings, online, or written comments that are submitted to us.
I'm assuming any proposal you make will have some opposition and some support. So in the end of this process, how do you figure out what the state could do?
It's kind of like being an umpire at a baseball game. No matter what call you make, you're going to make half the people upset with your call. But you try to make the best call that you can. We do the exact same thing. We get opposition, we get people who are for the project. So what we look at is we look at those issues, we look at those comments, and then what we try to do in order is we look to avoid impacts first off, then we look to minimize the impacts, then we look to mitigate the impacts. And we try to do that in that order: avoid, minimize, and mitigate those impacts that we see throughout the corridor.
If the state decides there's too much opposition to some of the routes that have already been identified as options, are there alternatives? Are there other things that the state will start to look at, or are these four, A, B, C, and D, kind of the only ones you're considering?
Right now, those are the only ones we're considering. What we did is we went through about a year's study to bring a universe of alternatives, many alternatives, down to a reasonable range. So what we look to do in this next year is take those reasonable range of alternatives and do a deeper dive into an environmental and technical analysis. Then we bring those back to the public and our agencies, our local agencies and governments, with a recommended alternative. And yes, then we bring that back to the public and see, did we do our job right? Did we compare and contrast those alternatives? And then we go through another year after that and come up with a preferred and then a selected alternative. So every time we try to analyze and address the comments that we get and hopefully come to a consensus at the end of the environmental impact statement process.
From here, how long out is that process till you have a preferred route?
From now, it would be probably in about 2019, late 2019.
Now to Avra Valley, where there's a lot of opposition to the proposed routes under review. I spoke with Robin Clark, who lives there.
My opposition is very personal for me because I live in the Avra Valley, and ADOT is considering 2 Interstate 11 routes that would pass through the Avra Valley. They're labeled C and D on the study maps. And both of those routes would pass very close to my neighborhood. And as a result, our neighborhood would be heavily impacted by the increased air, light, and noise pollution from an interstate highway. And if I can, I'd just love to tell you about my neighborhood and why it's so special and why we chose to live there. Our neighborhood shares borders with Tucson Mountain Park and Saguaro National Park. We look out over the Avra Valley and the Ironwood Forest National Monument to the west of us. And there are other protected lands nearby our neighborhood, and it's one of the reasons it's such a special neighborhood and such a wonderful place to live. And an interstate highway in the area would just be have devastating consequences for the people and the environment, both in our neighborhood and the Avra Valley. Just last spring, 2 of our neighbors spotted 2 bighorn sheep in our neighborhood. It was the first sighting in 60 years in our area. And we believe the bighorn sheep came from a herd that's part of the Ironwood Forest National Monument, and they would have had to cross the Avra Valley to get into our neighborhood, and that would not have been possible had there been an interstate highway blocking their way.
And our map is a very simplified version of what the state has made. Those maps, the more complicated maps that you can see a lot more detail, are on the state I-11 study website. But essentially, both those C and D routes, they sort of skirt in between those 2 national forest, national park that you referenced. Would there be what kind of alternatives would work for you since this study is underway?
Yes, well, the best alternative, in my opinion, is to expand and improve the existing I-10 corridor through Tucson.
And on the map, that's labeled as options A and B, I-19 and I-10.
Widen them, double-deck a portion. It would be far cheaper. It wouldn't bypass the businesses in Tucson that would stand to gain from the increased traffic over time from Interstate 11.
Now, the state is studying these possible routes and says it hasn't come to a conclusion yet. Is that, do you feel that's genuine? Do you feel that it's still a possibility those C and D routes could be off the table at some point?
I would like to think so. I mean, they've currently flagged them as needing further study, and we've been told that that means they're going to drill down and get into some of the more detailed environmental, social, community issues. I do hope that they mean that genuinely, and we're not just being misled into thinking that they're doing a study, that they're doing the due diligence, but in fact, their intent is to go forward with the bypass route. So I'm hopeful, but yet I'm a little skeptical of the process.
Let me ask you to respond to the people who don't feel the way you do, who feel that expanding I-10, I-19 is very expensive, would have a impact on the metro area, and if we can move the highways away, that would keep truck traffic, out of central Tucson, and they're all going to be expensive.
Well, I would say an interstate highway through the Avra Valley will bypass Tucson businesses, so it will cost existing businesses revenue. I'm talking about gas stations, hotels, restaurants, the places that travelers stop. And also, it would be far cheaper to expand or double-deck a portion of I-10 than it would be to create a brand new interstate highway in a rural area where no such infrastructure currently exists.
Are you basing that on figures from the state?
Yes. In the past, I've heard that double-decking a portion of I-10, for example, even though the cost per mile would be higher than building an interstate, it would be far cheaper because it would only be a smaller portion of the interstate that would have to be double-decked to handle the additional capacity. So the overall cost would be far cheaper than building a new interstate.
Clark has started a petition on MoveOn.org to oppose the I-11 highway proposed routes in Avra Valley. The state continues to accept public comment on the proposals. Contact information is on our website. Also this week, the Regional Transportation Authority met to review an audit of its performance so far and to look at the looming issues and future of the RTA. That's a voter-approved plan for 20 years of road construction, paid for with a half-cent sales tax throughout the county. After the meeting, I interviewed Sahuarita Mayor Tom Murphy, who is the chairman of the RTA board. You just got out of a meeting where the RTA board was going over the results of an audit of the progress so far, 11 years into the plan. The results said that projects are being delivered on time and on budget. Some of the delays or cost changes, the auditor said, were within reason. They were reasonable changes. There were also a few negatives. One of them was that it's hard to know if the projects are actually being effective, because how can you tell if they're reducing congestion? So what's your impression of those audit results?
Yes, well, I was excited. It's, as you said, we're 11 years into the process of a 20-year plan, And having gone through the Great Recession for a lot of that, I think it really showed the commitment and the will of the different municipalities that cooperate under the RTA. One of the things I haven't been on the RTA very long, and one of the things I complimented really the county and the city of Tucson for when the RTA was formed many years ago. They really allowed one seat, one vote, and it wasn't proportional based on population. I think that the auditors, I think, were very impressed with that they sort of allowed that strong foundational framework. And going through the difficult financial times for some of this, it was nice to say that promises made, promises delivered, and where there was some shortfalls, and there could be in the future as well. There's the attitude to use redirecting some federal and state funding to help backstop some of that. So I think the importance of really delivering on what we said we were going to do as an organization will lead to more success, not only for the next 10 years, but you might know there's ongoing conversations on trying to, at some point, really having the conversation now about reauthorizing it, because it really, we all were mentioning this morning, if it hadn't been for the RTA during these last 11 years going through the Great Recession, I don't know what projects that would have been completed, because the vast majority of them, 775 projects, over $1 billion worth of projects, you take that out of the mix over the last 11 years, our community wouldn't look as it would. And I know there's still more work to do, more things to be delivered.
We'll get into the conversation about reauthorizing in a bit, but part of that will be whether you kept your promise to voters. And I know there's been this ongoing debate for the past 11 years, how much to stick to the projects voters approved in 2006 by a majority vote versus make some changes to those to tweak the reality of what's happening on those roadways or what the people who use and live near those roads want. Broadway is a great example, a project that, according to the original RTA plan, should have already been widened to 6 lanes and completely done between Euclid and Country Club, but it's still up for debate and it's still being tweaked.
Right.
How do you balance those?
Yeah, well, balancing is a good word. That's always challenging and difficult, but I think the overriding thought process should be, what did we say we were going to commit to in the beginning? Because I think, I know from living in my community, and again, not being on the RTA very long, that the RTA, the PAG, has a very good reputation for not only working regionally, but also coming through on their commitments. So I think there has to be probably always a willingness to look at new circumstances, maybe they're extreme circumstances, but I think the overriding decision-making thought process should be, what did we say we were going to do to the voters? As you know, I'm on the school board as well. And down in Sahuarita, that comes up. If you say we're going to build a new school and we're going to do that, they really want to, the voters, I think, should, and they're deserving so, should hold us accountable. So I think it should be the same. But that's why we have, regular meetings to, if something does come down the pike that is so different, we can have that discussion. But I still think, my personal opinion is, the overriding decision should start with, what did we say we were going to do? And then continue the conversation from there.
The RTA plan and the projects that it funds expires in 2026,
Right.
and the sales tax that pays for those expires in 2026. What are the conversations you're having now about whether to continue it past that or to ask voters to continue it?
Right, and we're really at the front end of that. Mayor Rothschild brought up today that this probably will take 3 or 4 years to have these conversations. And it will depend, because a lot of folks, we have new folks living here who probably don't know about the success of the last 11 years, as well as during the foreclosure, we had a lot of turnover of residents. So I've been here the whole time, so living in the community. So I really have seen all these projects move forward, but I think it will be important to spend. And that's why this sort of pause to reflect not only on the audit, but we're really just a little ways halfway through to really start having those conversations with the community, because I know from my various hats, asking for new money is not easy, and a lot of it comes from the confidence they have on what a particular organization has done previously and have they fulfilled their promises. And the RTA, I think, was just one of the best examples of really following through on our commitments and delivering the projects, throughout the different jurisdictions. So I think that united communication as well as the united voice is the only way we're going to be successful getting a reauthorization. But those conversations, I think, will be starting now. And just like on the first authorization, it failed 4 times previously. And part of it was, I think, the good oversight during these last 11 years, but also the good interaction with our communities on what the projects the voters were asking for and requiring. If they think you're delivering on things that they don't feel is necessary, it's much harder to get those things passed. So I think we'll spend these next few years reaching out to the community and identifying what are the projects that the potential reauthorization would help fill the need. And now we have conversations with the Sonoran Corridor and I-11 and these other major economic development projects that could be coming through our community.
So is it a question of whether to ask voters to renew the RTA or extend it, or you are going to go, you just need to make the right plan before you go to voters? When you have 5 people or 7 people on there, everybody will have their own opinion. My own personal opinion is that when we're completed over these last 20 years, 10, 9 to go, 11 behind us, that it will be so successful and has been so successful. I think that the voters will be willing to do it, but we haven't asked the voters yet. So I think it's going to continue. I personally think it has been that successful that the voters will be in favor of it, but I think it goes back to you have to engage with the voters, you have to identify the right projects that they will be in favor of, and then tell the story on how the last, 20 years, how we've come through with what we said we were. And I'm rather confident that if we tell the story, engage with the public as we did on the first go-around, that it will be successful. What's the timeline for when you might go to voters and ask this question? We really haven't had that discussion. I think what I heard today was we want to really start engaging in that and deciding when we may reauthorize it. But that's going to be, again, having 9 years in front of us. I think that's a really proactive approach because it gives us some time to, one, discuss it and then decide what the best course of action is to go. But certainly engagement with the community is paramount to do that, because I think people have learned, probably the one thing I hear about all the time is roads and condition of roads. If you don't have great infrastructure, I don't believe you'll have great economic development opportunities. Regardless of RTA extensions or I-11 construction, one thing is certain: it's dangerous to text and drive, and local governments are taking action. Oro Valley, Tucson, Pima County, and the state all have some level of texting or phone use bans. So I asked Murphy Woodhouse to help explain them. He's the transportation reporter at the Arizona Daily Star. Murphy, what did Pima County approve this week regarding cell phone use and driving?
So they approved an ordinance that bans all non-hands-free use of any handheld electronic device. Cell phones are, of course, going to be the most important and relevant for that. That decision on Tuesday modified an existing ordinance that was approved last summer unanimously, which, while also being a primary offense, did include a number of exemptions that some officials say made it very difficult to enforce. Perhaps most important there is the fact that both the making and receiving of phone calls was allowed under the previous ordinance. And of course, if you're a law enforcement officer, from the outside looking in, the difference between making a call and sending a text probably very difficult to ascertain. And then also there was another exemption. You could use your cell phone while stopped in the road. And this is something that a lot of us see, drivers getting to the stoplight, pulling out their phone, checking their whatever. that is no longer allowed either. So those were two exemptions that some officials said made the previous one very difficult to enforce. And in fact, one of the Sheriff's Department's officers shared some of the enforcement data over the last year under the previous ordinance that is now gone or modified. And it was, I believe, 24 citations in a year and 17 warnings, which suggests that this was not the easiest ordinance to enforce. It keeps the same fine schedule, $100 for any offense, whether that's your first, second, third, whatever. However, if you are involved in an accident, that'll be $250. It will remain a primary offense as opposed to a secondary offense, and that simply means that an officer can pull you over for a violation just of that. They wouldn't need to see you violate some other rule to be able to pull you over.
So we often refer to this as rules about texting while driving, but you're saying any handheld use means if you're checking a map or an address or something like that, just doing anything touching your phone would qualify as illegal under the county ordinance.
I guess not just phone necessarily. I mean, it says handheld electronic device. Obviously,
okay.
the most relevant for most people is going to be a cell phone. But yes, it is any non-hands-free use of any such device. So yes, making a call, sending a text, checking a map, anything that takes a single hand away from driving would constitute an offense.
And then you mentioned that this is a primary offense, and that is relevant to the whole conversation. So they're primary offenses, secondary offenses. Explain the difference.
So a secondary offense is one that you could only be cited for if you are pulled over for a primary offense. So if, just to make this as real as possible, if a law enforcement officer were to see you violating or committing a secondary offense, they could not pull you over, even though they have reason to believe that you're breaking the law. They would first need to observe you breaking a primary.
Like speeding.
Like speeding, running a stoplight, and they would say, do you know why I pulled you over? Yes, you were speeding, but I also noticed that you were on your phone clearly, and you're going to be cited for that as well. But a primary offense, you see that, you can pull them over.
That covers Pima County, but there's a different ordinance in Tucson and one in Oro Valley. I want to make sure we just get through the differences of those. So Tucson, what is happening that went into effect this week?
All three of them are broadly similar. All three of them prohibit the non-hands-free use of any handheld electronic device. The key distinction in Tucson is that it was made a secondary offense. And as we just discussed, that would mean that an officer, a police officer, TPD in this case, would have to observe you breaking some other traffic law, or really any sort of law, before they could cite you for that. That modification, I believe that it was originally proposed as a primary offense, but after concerns raised by Councilwoman Regina Romero citing the potential for disproportionate policing of communities of color, the possibility of racial profiling, she advocated for making it a secondary offense. So the law itself, like what you cannot do, is basically the same in Oro Valley, Tucson, and unincorporated Pima County. The key distinction is that if you are in Tucson city limits, a police officer will have to see you committing some other violation, a primary offense, before they can pull you over and cite you for it.
In Oro Valley, is it primary or secondary?
In Oro Valley, it is a primary offense,
Okay.
and they have been they have not been citing people for it yet, but they have been handing out warnings with gusto. Officials in Pima County have said that they very much intend to have a months-long warning public education period where you'll be pulled over, but it will be a warning. It will be a conversation. One sheriff's department officer made it very clear, though, if you're involved in an accident, you will not be shown that leniency, and that will be a citation.
In the last few days, Governor Doug Ducey signed a bill regarding teenagers texting while driving. So this is, I think, the fourth in our four that we need to go over. What is that one?
So that was SB 1080, and while it only applies to drivers with learning licenses and the first 6 months, I believe, of having your first regular license, that does constitute the first statewide ban of any kind. There have been a number of efforts over the last decade or so. All have failed, and so while the vast majority of drivers in Arizona are exempted from this, it does constitute the first statewide prohibition, and that now takes away the distinction from Arizona being one of two states that has no statewide ban, and now it is perhaps unsurprisingly, Montana that remains the only state without any sort of statewide ban on texting. I say unsurprisingly because Montana, of course, was very famously one of the last states in the union to prohibit drinking and driving. They were one of the last to pass an open container law in 2005, I believe.
That's it for us. Catch up on the rest of the week's news on our website. Thanks for watching.